last spring break ever as a student, so a little bittersweet, but I got to sit around and do nothing for like a week, so that was good. That was good. I hope everyone else had a good week. I'm glad that the weather's finally clearing up. It was good for a couple of days, but it got kind of rainy last week. Last week we started our study on resurrection, and we started by speaking about resurrection in the Old Testament. And what we did was we started from creation, from the beginning in Genesis 1, and we told the story of resurrection that goes through the Old Testament up until Ezekiel in the Valley of the Dry Bones. And from that story we learned that resurrection changes everything, even how we live. Especially how we live. That in light of the resurrection, we have to live different. So this week we're going to continue in that theme. We're going to learn something different this week, and we're not going to be in the Old Testament, we're going to be in the New. And there's no one better to study resurrection with than Christ in the New Testament. He is the embodiment of resurrection. So we're going to be in the Gospel of John today. That's the fourth Gospel. And the Gospel of John is unique. It's different than all the other Gospels. The Gospel of John seeks to prove that Jesus is God. It's different because it shows the power of God narrating in miracles. That's what it does. So today, much like last week we started and we told a big long story about how Israelites got to where they were and where they were going. Today, our text is in John chapter 11. It's when Jesus raises his friend Lazarus up from the grave, a physical resurrection. Today, much like last week, we're going to start at the beginning of John. We're going to tell the story up to then because you can't understand the context of Lazarus' resurrection without understanding the theme that goes throughout John. That through this book that John wrote, through the stories that are presented, we find what the meaning of the resurrection of Lazarus is. And this is because the readers of John, the original readers, understood that Jesus resurrected from the dead. They could say that, and they understood that Jesus was God. But to really understand it, they could say it, but to really understand it, they needed to see it acted out. They needed to see stories in which God proves to be who he claims he was in Jesus. So that's what John seeks to do. And what we're going to learn today, the main point once we get to chapter 11 is going to be that there's no other life outside of Christ. And we are to believe in it. There's no other life outside of him in which we should believe. So starting in John 1, just like Genesis, John 1 starts with the beginning of all things. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." And John continues in that theme talking about Jesus. We find out that the Word that's being narrated here, in the beginning was the Word, that Word was Jesus. John the Baptist, not the author of John, but John the Baptist, comes and he starts to preach about Jesus. He starts to tell wonderful stories about this man, the Christ that is coming. And at one point he points to Jesus and says, "Look, there's the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world." That's this Jesus. And it's after this that the disciples start following him, and he starts to call the disciples. But even in the story, the disciples don't understand who Jesus is at first. They don't get it. The world does not know who exactly Jesus is. They know who John says he is. But who is he really? So after Jesus calls his disciples, the first disciples were John the Baptist's disciples, and then he calls Philip and Nathanael. After he calls them, we see a series of 7 miracles that happens in John. The first happens in chapter 2. It's a famous one. It is Jesus changing the water into wine. This is actually like one of the first memories I had at church, was learning about this story, how Jesus turned water into wine. He gets invited to a wedding at Cana. And weddings, kind of like weddings today, have receptions, but Unlike today, their receptions lasted several days. Right? It was very expensive to have a wedding. And they were celebrating the wedding, but more they were celebrating the union of the two families. It was a contract between the two families. And they were celebrating. But at this wedding that Jesus went to, they ran out of wine. And that's a problem for the days back then, because you can't have a party without wine because they can't drink anything else. They don't have a way to keep grape juice fresh. So they have to drink this wine. Well, Jesus wants the party to go on again. And he says, bring me some water. After Mary, his mother, says, they ran out of wine. What are we going to do? And Jesus turns water into wine. Immediately, it turns to wine. That's powerful. That's a miracle. The disciples don't really know how he did it. No one really knows how he did it, apart from a miracle. So, to prove he is who he says he is, and he is who John the Baptist says he is, first he changes water into wine. He changes something into something else. Not just for a magic trick, but to prove who he is. And then the story continues. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and he cleanses the temple of the sellers. He flips over some tables. And then he teaches a little bit. And then it's not until chapter 4 that we find the second miracle of Christ. Now, after Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman, telling her to leave the sin that she's in, and the disciples return to Jesus, Jesus meets an official. And this official comes to find Jesus. He searches Jesus out because he's heard that Jesus is powerful. And this official comes to Jesus and says, my son is dying. My son is ill. Can you help? And Jesus eventually agrees to help him. He says, yes, I will heal your son. Now go. So the official leaves and goes back. It's a while to get to his house. He gets back the next day, and he finds that his son is no longer sick. The fever has left him. And when he's talking to his servant, the fever left him the very hour that Jesus was talking to. So it's clear that the healing came from Christ. First, Jesus changes water into wine. Then he heals a boy from a far distance. That's powerful. Then, right after that, the next story, Jesus meets an invalid. He goes to Jerusalem, and then by a pool in Jerusalem, he sees a man who can't walk. In Jesus' day, if you couldn't walk, it was basically a death sentence, because if you couldn't walk, you couldn't work, and if you couldn't work, you couldn't get food. You weren't really used to your family, so you were a burden on your family. So often they would go out into these public places and beg. And after meeting this invalid, this person that couldn't walk, Jesus heals him. Jesus makes this man who couldn't walk, wasn't really good for anything, into a person that could walk. A person that was clean. A person that could work. He gave him a new life, is what he did. So he can change water into wine. He can heal a boy from a distance. He can make the lame walk. This guy is powerful. This Jesus is more than just a man. But then we continue, and a couple chapters later, after Jesus does some teaching, he's got a pretty big following. About 5,000 men following Jesus. But there was a problem because they weren't really able to provide food for this many people, and Jesus was still teaching. So Jesus sees this problem and says, bring me the food that you have, and there's a couple loaves of bread and some fish. And with that bread and those fish, Jesus feeds 5,000 men. With food that maybe would feed 4 men, he feeds 5,000 men. And that's not counting women and children that might have been with him. Jesus is powerful. He is more than just a man. Not all rabbis could do this. One rabbi could do this. So first, he changes water into wine. Second, he heals a boy. Third, he makes a lame man walk. And fourth, he feeds the 5,000 men. And the very next story in John is Jesus performing another miracle. The disciples were sailing on the Sea of Galilee, a stormy sea. It's one that just gets rocked with storms. And during one of these storms, the disciples are very frightened. And then they look out, and they see a man walking on the water. Just walking on the water. They might not know science as well as we do today, but they knew that people couldn't walk on water. If you get into water, you sink. And yet in the middle of this lake, middle of this sea, Jesus is walking. And he gets on the boat, and then the text says they immediately appear at their location. They're away from the storm. So Jesus can now change nature and walk on water. He can defy the rules of buoyancy. Who is this man? He's not like all other rabbis. So, first, he changes water into wine. Then he heals a sick boy. Then he makes a lame man walk. Then he feeds the 5,000. Then he walks on the water. That's 5. And a couple chapters later, after many people desert Jesus, many people leave Jesus because his teachings start to get a little odd. He starts saying, I am the bread of life. And the people don't understand what he's saying. And Jesus goes to a feast of the tabernacles and he starts to teach. And after this, in a couple of chapters, in chapter 9, we see Jesus, in maybe one of the oddest stories in all of Scripture, heal a blind man. Now this man was blind from birth. It's not like he had an accident where he had temporary blindness. He had never seen before. And when he approaches Jesus, Jesus does something just odd. And he spits on the ground. He crouches down. He spits on the ground. And with his finger, he swirls it into mud. The dust into mud. And he puts it on the eyes of the man. And then he can see. And now, I don't know why Jesus had to choose this. It's a little odd. This past summer, I was in charge of a youth event session thing at a camp. And I was teaching the kindergartners this story. I don't know why I chose this story. It was a poor choice, because it's no sooner than I said that did they spit on the ground and start wiping it on each other's eyes. There's too many of them for me to control. It was a bad idea. Don't spit on the ground and wipe it in your brother's eyes, all right? All right, I'm talking to you two. Yeah. Don't do it. Don't do it. But Jesus heals this man this way. Jesus turns water into wine. He heals a boy from far away. He makes the lame man walk. He feeds 5,000 people. He walks on the water, and he can heal the blind. Jesus is powerful. And his 7th miracle, the last miracle we see Jesus do before the resurrection, at least the last one that's narrated, is his greatest yet. The disciples still don't understand who Jesus is. He's done all these great things, but they still don't see him for what he is. And that's where we get to verse 11. That's where we end up, and Jesus' friend Lazarus is sick. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother was Lazarus, now lay sick. It was the same one that poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. And when Jesus heard this, he said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed there for 2 more days. So Jesus